So today's speaker is Mark Skarpness, right? And he is Director of Systems Engineering at the Intel Open Source Technology Lab here in Hillsboro. And he's going to give a little background of where he's come from to get where he is, as well as some advice to you as you think about your career path.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here and have a chance to chat with you all. I'm going to be fairly brief in terms of, just talk about my background, what I've done at Intel a little bit, kind of what we're up to in the Open Source Technology Center, and also kind of when we're hiring, what do we look for, what are some of the things people do that stand out for us anyway. And then I'll save, the bulk of the time just for Q&A, really questions about anything you want to ask. So I've been at Intel for 20 years. I've really spent my entire professional career at Intel. So I joined just as the Pentium was coming out. For those of you that remember the history of Intel. I actually interviewed in Santa Clara the day the Pentium was launched. So that was kind of cool. My background, I have a master's in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. But it was really computer engineering, so I did a lot of computer science and a bit of electrical engineering, but I was very much focused more on the software side. And that's been true through my career at Intel. It's been mostly focused on the software part of Intel. People think of Intel as a hardware company, but if you took us as a standalone software company, we'd be, I think, the 4th largest software company in the world. So we employ a lot of software engineers, and that continues to grow. So I started my career as a software engineer, doing software development, fairly close to the hardware, doing work on device drivers and PC system development. I've been doing engineering management for the last 10 years or so, but I'm involved in a lot of the strategy work that we're doing. And the group that I work in it's called Open Source Technology Center, which, as you might guess from the name, we do a lot of work on open source related things. My boss, Ahmad, likes to say that we're kind of everything that's not Microsoft inside of Intel from a software point of view, which is kind of true from an OS and platform point of view. We obviously do a ton of work with Microsoft as well, and continue to do that. But the reason that we do open source and what we do fundamentally, it's really focused on, it got its start anyway. We have new hardware coming out roughly every year, new platforms, client platforms, server platforms. The engineers have put some cool new features in them that they hope will be useful to somebody. But in order to make that a reality, we have to do software enablement. And in the Linux space, think about all the servers that are running Google and Amazon and Facebook, those are all running Linux. And we want to make sure that in the Linux system on those servers, they can take advantage of our hardware features. So really, if you look back about 10 plus years ago when we got started doing open source work, it was all focused on, let's make sure that the Linux kernel has the right support for these new features that are coming out on our platform. For example, we did some hardware that supports virtualization. So we did a bunch of work to enable that in open source. As the years have gone by, we've grown that into a much broader range of things. We're doing a lot of work these days on Android. Android is based on the Linux kernel. There's an open source project called the Android Open Source Project. That's essentially the starting point for every Android device that you see out there. So we do a lot of contributions into the Android Open Source Project. And lots of other things. So we're really focused on creating an environment that attracts people that like to do open source. So open source developers tend to do their work in the open. I mean, that's fundamental to doing open source development. And if you look back 10 years ago, we were very afraid to do that as a company. It's taken a long time to build a culture that understands, hey, this is how open source works, this is how open source developers work, and here's how we create an environment that actually is conducive to that, where they can work in their projects out in the open and also bring benefit to the company. So we've grown tremendously over the last 10 years and attracted a lot of that talent. One of the cool things about open source, and this is kind of, for those of you that are interested in doing that kind of software development, you basically are creating a resume for yourself when you're doing open source development. We've hired a lot of people by looking at, for example, we've been looking at WebKit. WebKit is the core of pretty much all the browsers out there except Firefox and Internet Explorer. So the browser on your Android device, the browser on your iPhone, Chrome, Safari, those are all built on top of WebKit. And we realized, hey, we need to be more active in WebKit. This is an important piece of technology. We need to have more influence over it. and we decided we wanted to hire people there. Well, what we did is we went out and looked at the open source project and looked at who were the top committers. And we said to our recruiter, let's go target these guys, these gals, because they're the people that are contributing to the project. And that's been true in a lot of cases. When we want to hire people in the Linux kernel community, they're already known, they've already been contributing. So if you have a passion in an area that lines up with some open source project out there, you can go today and get started in a small way. You don't have to be a major contributor to start with. You can be doing bug fixing, you can do documentation, but it's a great way to not only learn about some piece of technology, but also start building that reputation. It's a really good thing to have in your hand. If you come and interview in our group, you have that sort of example you can point to. That's a great thing to have. Some of the other things that I've seen changing from an Intel point of view in the software world, and you're probably learning about some of these things, in your classes. The web is emerging very strongly as kind of a unifying platform. So we've been really focused on HTML5 as the application platform. Of course, on Android today, you have Java. On iOS, you have Objective-C. But a lot of apps, even if they may have a Java or Objective-C shell around them, the actual content, a lot of it is done in web. And we think that's going to continue to grow in terms of becoming more and more the standard way that people write applications. So we're doing a lot of investment around the infrastructure to support those applications running on our platforms. So I think learning about the web platform, HTML5, and how it ties into a system, really interesting area that we've actually invested a lot in recently. Another thing that we've spent a lot of energy on and are still, I think, learning is how to build systems. So we're fundamentally a silicon company in terms of what we do for a living, we sell silicon. But in the old days, software for Intel was primarily about writing device drivers. We had Wintel, right, Microsoft and Intel. We wrote the device drivers, Microsoft did the operating system, OEMs built the PCs, and that was the ecosystem. Today, when we're also in a world where there's a lot of Android devices out there, we have to do the whole system. We have to do device drivers all the way through the end user experience. We have to make sure that whole thing works properly. So people that understand bottom to top how the system works and can go in and solve problems and make things work, whether it's performance or power consumption, how the overall experience functions, extremely valuable skills to have. To really have a broad view of how does a system work from bottom to top. Being an expert in any of those areas is also great. Graphics expert or a kernel expert or a UI expert. But if you can go across those areas and solve problems across boundaries, really, really valuable. Something that we're hiring a lot of people that understand systems. Systems from a silicon point of view, systems from a software point of view, and how to really bring the whole thing together. So that's something that I've seen change a lot and is continuing to evolve inside of Intel. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, for us is just the cadence of products is so much faster now than it used to be. And we used to do processors, start to finish was probably 4 years. Something on the order of 4 years from beginning to think about it to silicon out the door. We've got to turn that so much faster now. We're still not as fast as we need to be, but it needs to get down into the range of 6 to 12 months. 12 months is kind of the target for silicon now. We have to be even faster than that. Which means you have to do everything faster. You have to pull your software in much, much earlier. So that's another thing from a software point of view. We're doing software enabling on pre-silicon simulators so that when the silicon shows up, we can actually start running Android or Chrome OS or whatever or Windows or whatever the target operating system is. So again, the software part of that is getting drawn in so much earlier than it ever used to be. So although we're a silicon company from a product point of view, we have a huge number of software engineers doing all sorts of things, from making sure the silicon works right, optimizing the platform, doing applications, doing optimizations. So it's a tremendously exciting time to be a software person at Intel, and I think in the world in general. We have such a hard time finding somebody that's really skilled at doing Android systems development today. Can write their own ticket pretty much. It's a really, really hot area, and I think it will continue to be that as you see these devices proliferate into wearables and all these new devices that are going to show up. The fundamental thing that makes those devices work is the software, good or bad. And the other part of that we've also been focusing on in the open source group is the user experience. People think about the user experience as what you see on the screen, but it's really, and Apple is the shining example of how they can turn user experience into a great competitive differentiator. It's the whole thing. It's the package. It's the hardware. It's the way you interact with the software. And we've been hiring a bunch of designers who know how to do that. That's a really different world of how do you do design. But then it's how do I realize that design? And I think where it intersects with you is we tend to couple the pure designers with the software engineers. The designers for a piece of software saying, hey, this is the experience I want to deliver to the user. How do I make that real? What are the things that are doable and are not doable? So that there's a lot of back and forth between the design world and the engineering world so that we can actually deliver something that's truly a great experience. So that language is starting to come much more strongly into Intel as well. So that's something I've seen really change a lot in the last few years is the recognition that designing silicon features, who cares? Right? Nobody's going to buy our chips because of some arcane feature, which is always the way that we traditionally sold stuff. It's got more megahertz, it's got more cores, it's got this feature, that feature. What people buy, certainly what consumers buy, is they buy an experience for them. So we're thinking a lot more about experience down rather than feature up design. So we'll start out by thinking about what's the experience we want the end user to have, and then translate that down into what are the silicon things we need to do, what are the software things we need to do. And we're still in the process, I think, of learning how to do that. But understanding the design world and how that works and thinking about the experience, the overall experience of whatever you're building, I think that's going to be something that everybody's going to be doing. Everybody selling into the consumer space in some way will certainly be doing that. It's really critical. So it's been an interesting 20 years for me at Intel to see us transform from very PC-centric. I think really now we're on this journey of becoming much more of a mobile-centric company in terms of where we're designing things. Obviously, the server business and the mobile side, I think, are the two places where we're really focused going forward. So a lot of new challenges for software people in that. I think software people will be everywhere, across the company. They're the critical resource these days in projects, which is kind of cool because we used to be kind of second-class citizens in a way. We're not anymore. So I'll stop there, and if you have any questions really on anything, happy to answer.
Come on.
Yeah, this is a dumb one, but I'm
Oh,
sorry.
no dumb.
What's the last thing you said I missed it? We used to be second-class citizens, or?
Oh, software people at Intel
Oh,
used to
just
be
software.
in general used to be second-class. If you wanted to be cool, you had to be designing software. That was really true. It's not. That's really not true anymore. Yeah.
You had mentioned in the beginning that you were kind of going to mention a few things that made people stand out other than open source contributing.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that would make a candidate stand out to you?
Sure. I think for my group in particular, we're doing a lot of hiring around the web. So experience and familiarity with web technologies is a good one. We're doing a lot of hiring around Android across the whole breadth of all the way from apps down to core system stuff. So experience there is really good. Even if you're not doing open source development per se, we use now a lot of the open source tools inside of the company. So things like Git, Garrett, there's this open source development flow that is used heavily in the Android world. We use that internally. So understanding those tools and that workflow. We're starting to do a little bit of agile development, so I wouldn't say that's something that we necessarily look for as a must-have skill, but we're certainly leaning more in that direction. So I think if you've had experience with agile or Scrum or something along those lines, we're doing that more and more. Really being driven, I think, more by the developers than by the managers, actually. So we've started doing it kind of in a small way, and it's kind of caught on. So that's a good one. People who understand a bit of the hardware, since we are fundamentally still selling hardware, that's really a really good thing to have in your background. You don't necessarily have to have a hardware degree, but understanding how the whole system works and being able to go down and debug something that involves hardware issues, because we tend to be doing a lot of work on new platforms where you do need to at least be able to look inside and say, oh, there's something going on here with the hardware. You can always pull in somebody that has more skill, but having that, not being just limited at all, I don't understand anything below the app. So obviously the operating system and to some extent, the hardware and how it works. Those are all, yeah, all good. There's a question about you.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you mentioned the design versus the engineering kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
And how there's kind of a tension and that there aren't many people in the middle of that. I'm just curious, like, do you see people that are actually designers and software engineers? Is that a thing?
It is a rare skill for somebody to have a really good eye for design and also be an engineer, but we do have people that maybe they're not necessarily doing both, but they understand both, so they can bridge the gap, and that's a super valuable skill to have. You know, if you can talk to a designer in their terms and understand what they're trying to do, because some designers, depends on the designer, but sometimes they can be pretty far out there in terms of very abstract thinking and very different than how engineers tend to think. But being able to talk to them and understand what they're trying to achieve and translate that into the engineering side, really valuable. And we have a few people like that, but that's a pretty rare skill. Yeah. But in order to make something really work, you need those kind of people. There are companies who actually really silo design and engineering, where they'll actually do the design in its entirety and they'll throw it over the wall, if you will, and then build it. We think that's actually really not the right way to do it. So we tend to do a lot of tightly integrated engineering and design teams. Although they're doing their own work, they are talking a lot about, hey, here's what I'm building, here's what I'm designing, can you build it? And feedback in both directions.
So you're saying that the designer would absolutely be on the design end and the engineer would absolutely...
In some companies, they do structure it that way.
Okay.
Yes.
But not in it.
Not in it. And there's still a lot of thinking going on inside the company around how do we really structure design, because it's such a new thing for us. You know, if you looked at the company 5 years ago, we didn't have anybody that did this. We've hired a fair number of people from the outside who understand design, but we haven't fully comprehended yet how do we integrate that into our internal structure. So it's still kind of scattered around a bit in the company. We have a pretty good team inside of the Open Source Technology Center. So we've gotten some, I think, good learnings of how to help the engineers and designers work better together. You know, really through co-locating and having them daily interacting with each other. Yeah.
In terms of getting involved in open source projects, at the stage where we're at as students, is it better to work on multiple projects to sort of get a sense of what's going on with different projects, or is it better to try and pick one and try and focus on that to make a more substantive contribution?
I think it kind of depends on your own interest. So if there's an area that you really find fascinating, I think it's great to dive in and participate in one. But participating in a number to get a sense of what's going on and what you like is equally fine. Unless you have, if you have a year or so to spend building up a reputation and getting to a level where you're really recognized, that's the sort of thing that will probably pay off more in terms of, people will seek you out. If you're in the right project, you'll get people who will come and find you. But just having that background and familiarity and being able to talk about, hey, I've been working on these projects and here's what's going on and here's some of the challenges, I think that makes you a much more credible candidate. You've clearly been out and been looking at what's going on and following those. I think that by itself is good. Yeah. If you came into the open source group interviewing and you didn't know anything about open source, that would be less good. If you were really, really sharp at something, you may still get a job. But it's good background to have because it's so common now.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark.
Yes, thank you very much.